This class is on the topic of research techniques. Now, it overlaps significantly with other classes in the same area, but it gives a slightly different perspective, so it's worth looking at. And it's worth making notes from this class as well as notes from the other classes with the same title or in related areas, and in that way compiling a comprehensive set of notes for yourself for study and revision purposes. So let's start talking about research techniques. We start with the idea of data collection, and to that end we could have secondary data, and the secondary data could be internal or external. Secondary data means the data has been compiled by someone else. It's been compiled perhaps for a different reason, for a different purpose, and it could be data related to the market, external data to the organization in other words, or it could be internal, looking at processes or facts and figures related to the internal running of the business. We also have primary data. Primary data is data collected for a particular purpose. It's collected from source. It is collected directly. And there are two types, qualitative and quantitative. Now, the qualitative, which is looking at attitudes and opinions and motivations, that could be looked at in terms of interviews and focus groups. It could also be looked at in terms of observation. The researcher may go and make observations directly into a particular phenomenon. The quantitative, well, there may be self-completion surveys, perhaps a questionnaire which is given to people and ask them to complete it and return it. Perhaps the response rate won't be very big, won't be very large, because a lot of people can't be bothered or don't get round to it, or don't have the time, or just not interested. It could be interviewer completed. It could be questionnaires in which an interviewer goes with the questionnaire and tries to get the answers directly and fill out the the questionnaire, I should say, fill it out directly. There can be surveys, or it could be telephone interviews, or it could be just observation again. And I say just, that's perhaps wrong, because observations can be a very rich source of information, because the observations can tell about the person's body language, about the situation in which they find themselves. And the quantitative approach is observation, it's counting, and it's measuring. So it's to do with numbers. Quantitative is trying to get information into numeric form so it can be analyzed. An average can be calculated, or a mean, or a median, or a mode, or a standard error, or whatever it is. Something can be calculated and can be used for decision purposes. Now, designing qualitative research, well, in a survey involving attitudes and opinions, the reasons for engaging in qualitative research must be made clear. So, when looking at attitudes and opinions, the reasons for qualitative research must be made clear. It must be clear to the reader. It must be also clear to the respondent as to why this technique has been selected. In addition, the choice of qualitative techniques must be explained. There are various qualitative techniques, participant observation, or focus group, or whatever. So whichever one is selected must be justified. So whichever approach to gaining an insight into qualitative issues, that approach must be justified. It must be explained as to why that one was picked and not a different one. Why were focus groups used as opposed to in-depth interviews, as opposed to observations, as opposed to self-completion or completed questionnaires. So in other words, whatever technique is used must be justified. Now, the qualitative research design. Well, the research design should discuss the following issues. How the sample selection is to be made, or was made. Depends if it's going to happen or if it did happen. So, how the sample selection is going to be made. If it's looking at a population and drawing a sample, the sample should be representative of the population. That's the whole idea in sampling. So it should be unbiased. And the sample should be selected in a way which means it is unbiased, because that is useful. If it's biased, it's no good. It's going to give distorted results and maybe actually dangerous for decision making. It may mislead the decision maker and may lead to bad decisions. Should also explain the rationale for the research. Why is the research taking place? It's important that the respondents understand why research is taking place. And make clear any ethical issues, for example confidentiality, or issues about publishing data, publishing results. Make sure that these issues are dealt with openly and clearly, and that the respondent knows. And explain the data collection technique and efforts at triangulation. In other words, explain to the respondent that this is a serious exercise, that they may be involved in an interview with the researcher, but the researcher will also try to pick up this by questionnaires, and the researcher may also try to pick it up by participant observation. So the researcher is triangulating. It's trying to get the same information from different directions, using different techniques. And if the researcher comes to the same conclusion using the various techniques, then that is a strong conclusion. So try to triangulate, try to pick up information on a particular topic in different ways, by focus group, by questionnaire, by participant observation. Use a variety of techniques and see if they all come to the same conclusion, because that would be a strong conclusion. Make sure that the questions are clear and have been piloted. Clarity only comes when they have been truly piloted, when they've been looked at by respondents who are critical of the questions, and those criticisms come back and the questions are amended accordingly. It's important that the original set of questions be taken as a first draft. There may be criticism of the questions. The respondents may not understand the questions clearly. So it's important that that feedback is taken into account and the questions are amended so that the respondents are able to more effectively respond to the questions. And code the questions and record them accurately. And make sure the questions are relevant and efficient. And there are separate videos on these. But it's absolutely vital that the respondent thinks that this is a worthwhile exercise. If the questions are irrelevant, then they should not be included. It should be an efficient use of the respondent's time. The respondent only has a limited amount of time to give, and it should be efficient, so the questions should be relevant. Critically analyze the data and discuss the limitations of the technique used. It's important that the technique used be seen with its criticisms in place. In other words, its limitations should be exposed. If it's an interview, talk about the limitations of it. Talk about the fact that it's one respondent and one amongst perhaps a small number of respondents. Talk about the issues of bias. Talk about the selection problems. Talk about the wording of the questions and the sequence of the questions and the use of prompting to get answers. So critically analyze the data and discuss its limitations. And try to ensure that the whole survey is kept within budget. It's important that there is a discipline about the whole activity and that it is kept within budget. Now, qualitative methods. Well, observation is where a researcher just observes, or it could be participant observation, where the researcher gets involved. Let's say it's in a business, the researcher works in the business and gains experience as a worker and reports back. Another qualitative method is interviews, focus groups, analyzing texts and documents, and recording and transcribing, recording answers and transcribing the answers. These are qualitative methods. Now, these are dealt with in other videos, as I said, but I'm going to run through some of these here just to give a different perspective, a slight variation on what's in the other videos, and ask you to look at both and make your own notes. Now, the advantages of observation and participant observation. Well, first of all, because it's a human being dealing with another human being, it fosters trust. It'll only happen if the researcher and the respondent agree. So there is an element of trust involved. And it could lead to greater long-term understanding. It could lead to better insight into the situation, which could lead to a better long-term understanding and perhaps return interviews because the respondent is willing to participate. The researcher can observe the events directly and also observe events around the focus of the study. That's important. The researcher can see not just the respondent, but the respondent's body language, their behavior, their reaction to questions, and also take into account the whole environment in which the event takes place. So it's a very rich way of collecting information. Information is very rich. It's very detailed. Now, the key issues, well, getting agreement to have an interview in the first place may be a problem. People are busy and people don't want to be interviewed perhaps, and they want to spend a lot of time with a researcher. So there could be a problem of getting entry. The researcher needs to fit into the role allowed. The extent of the participation also needs to be agreed. So if it's participant observation, then the researcher needs to fit into that role. How do they fit into the role? If they have to go and work in the business, then that needs to be agreed, and perhaps the other workers, if they know someone's in there making observations, they won't like it. It's like being spied upon. So it's like getting permission to enter the business in the first place, to make the observations. It's difficult. There are many obstacles to overcome in persuading people to agree to allow the research to take place. And the research could either be overt or covert. The research, if it's overt, then everyone knows that this person is a researcher, and this person's asking questions which will be recorded and used in research. That's overt research. Covert is when it's done secretively, and that may alienate some people. They may say that it's like being spied upon, as I said. So the covert approach may not be widely acceptable. Effect of the researcher on the setting. Well, the fact that there is a researcher means that the setting will be changed. People's behavior may change if they know there is somebody observing them. They may change for all sorts of reasons. They want to please the observer, or perhaps they're annoyed that they're being watched. And there's an issue of trying to decide the best data collection method. Does the observer make notes or complete forms as they're making observations, or do they use electronic devices, a voice recorder, for example, or how is the data collected? And will that also distort the information being collected? Now, there's an issue of objectivity in participant observation. The researcher, the observer, should remain objective and also try not to influence the outcome in any way. Now, it depends on the situations being observed, but if there is an injustice being perpetrated, it's very difficult for the observer to remain neutral. If it's an issue in the business and the observer is looking at a department and the operation of a department and sees that some workers who are paid less are doing more work and contributing more, it may be difficult for the researcher to report that objectively. There may be an element of trying to fix what has been observed. Well, that's not right. The researcher has to report objectively. That's the point. Just report what it's seen. Don't comment on whether it's right or wrong. It's report on what is seen. That is the issue. The role of the observer is to observe and record only. The researcher must minimize any impact on the environment. In forensic terms, they must not contaminate the scene. The researcher must accurately record observations. So the researcher should not influence the environment in which they're operating. Now, collecting data. Well, data collection methods for a start. There are a variety of ways in which to record observations. The obvious one is memory. Look at a situation, try to memorize it, and go back to the office and write it down. It's subject to issues and problems because people may forget details or may not observe all the details that were necessary, and there are issues in just relying on memory. Taking notes may be a good idea, but it may distort the information. If the observed see the observers taking notes, they may change their behavior. So taking notes might be a good idea in some circumstances. It depends, but care must be taken not to influence the information being recorded. A dictaphone might be useful, a small dictaphone, but again, it may influence the information being recorded. Nowadays, a smartphone may be used. Smartphones are the same as dictaphones in many respects, so that might be used. The problem is that they may influence the outcome, and that's the danger. So care must be taken when using data collection methods. The person being observed will see the observer perhaps taking notes and will change their behavior accordingly. There is an issue with validity. The sample must represent the population. That's what we mean by validity. And there are two types. External validity, the findings should apply universally. For example, outside the confines of the study itself. So the findings should be external. Having found some results, they should be extendable to beyond the survey. It should be generalized. So there should be external validity. The findings should apply universally. There's also internal validity. The findings should accurately represent the views of those observed. So, first of all, the findings should apply universally. They should indicate what the results are and indicate that this is what is likely to be the case in the wider environment. So there's external validity, and secondly, the internal validity is that the findings should represent the views of those being observed. They should be recorded accurately. Now, the qualities of the interviewer. Well, first of all, the interview is a transitory process. It's a social process. It only happens for a certain period of time and then it's over. So it's transitory. It requires interviewing skills and a good rapport with the respondent. The person conducting the interview should have good interviewing skills and should be able to relate to the respondent. Needs to be aware of interviewing bias, especially when probing for more information. The interviewer should be aware of the whole problem of bias and distortion in data collection, and when probing for more information, having asked a question, should be critically aware of the possibility of bias. Now, in-depth interviews, well, these should be structured, or could be structured. There are different possibilities. Structured. The same question wording is applied to all respondents for comparability. So it has a list of fixed questions which are given to all the respondents. And that way there's comparability in the answers. The questions could be open-ended or closed questions. An open-ended question allows the person being interviewed to, in their own words, say exactly what they feel. Closed questions could be yes, no, don't know, or the answer is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or whatever. So it's select from a narrow range of options. But the questions could be structured, could be open or closed. Semi-structure, this allows follow-up questions associated with the fixed questions. So there are some fixed questions. The respondent gives an answer, then based on the answer the interviewer can ask a follow-up question. Why do you feel like that? When did this happen? What were the effects of this? So some sort of follow-up question can come off. So it's semi-structured. We also have unstructured. This is where the objectives of the inquiry must be made clear and questions necessary to ensure the inquiry clearly set out. So the objectives of the inquiry should be clear. But having said that, the questions are unstructured. The respondent knows what the objectives of the inquiry are, but the questions are open-ended. They're just posed by the interviewer, and there's no particular structure to the exercise. However, the interviewer has latitude in respect to the order of the questions and the extent of the follow-up questions with unstructured. So the interviewer may have some guidelines about questions and may stick to the guidelines or may not, may deviate. Depends on how the interview is turning out. It depends on what's been said and what direction the interview is taking. Now the strengths of the in-depth interviews. Well, generally this approach yields a large amount of data. The responses are immediate and therefore this is a fast way to get information. Because there's a large amount of information, the responses need to be recorded. So there is a large amount of data produced in in-depth interviews, data about the questions, the responses to the questions, but also in-depth interviews can probe particular points, follow up on particular points, and make sure there's absolute clarity about the responses relating to particular points. And the information is flowing back immediately. So there's no waiting for information to be processed to understand what's happening. It's flowing back immediately and being clarified immediately. The interviewer has greater flexibility in questioning. The approach is suitable for follow-up questions that clarify and explain more fully. This improves the validity of the exercise. So, having asked a question and got an answer, a follow-up question can be asked. And a follow-up question to that again could be asked. So clarity is improved, and that of course improves the validity of the exercise. In other words, there is a much better chance that what has been asked relates to the objectives of the survey itself, and that the responses fit the objectives of the exercise, of the interviewing exercise. So the approach promotes greater understanding. Now, the limitations and weaknesses of this approach. Well, the interviews need cooperation. Both sides must agree. There must be an agreement by the interviewer and the interviewee to participate in this type of activity. And of course the interviewees may not tell the truth. They may find some of the questions too difficult, or they may find the questions too probing, so they decide to invent the answers. The context of the interview should be taken into account. Where is the interview taking place? Clearly, if it's in a nice setting, relaxed setting, there might be one set of results coming out of the interview, and if it's undertaken on a busy street with lots of noise and traffic, a different set of results may come out of it. Interviewers need appropriate training to maximize the outcome of the interview. The interviewers have to be trained completely. They have to know how to handle the questions, what appropriate probing questions follow on from each question. They have to be sensitive to the situation and to the topic under discussion. So interviewers have to be well trained. And the data will need careful analysis and sorting. Even when it's collected, even though it's coming back in an immediate form which enables probing questions, it still has to be analysed and sorted later. Now let's look at focus groups for a little bit. This is a group discussion on a selected theme. The group is selected on the basis of appropriateness, say consumers, clergymen, general public, teachers, policemen, whatever, and so on. So there's a group who have a particular theme and will be questioned on some issue relating to that group. A moderator is used to channel the discussion. The moderator is sometimes known as a facilitator. So a moderator will be used to ask the questions and get the group discussing it and controlling the direction of the discussion and making sure it's focused in on the issues that are particularly relevant. And the event should be recorded for later analysis. The environment should be conducive for discussion, and the atmosphere should be non-intimidating. The participants should feel at ease, should feel comfortable, not threatened in any way. They should speak openly and freely, and the environment should be conducive to that. Now, facilitation techniques. Well, ideally the participants should be similar in terms of gender, class, ethnicity or experience. But really it depends on the topic under consideration. But ideally and generally it's held that it should be similar. So gender, age, class, ethnicity, experience and so on. There should be some sort of similarity, but it depends on the topic under consideration. It's not universally true. The facilitator should highlight some common experience or common experiences of the participants, and it's a good way to start the focus group. Talk about their common experiences and see what flows from there. The overall feeling amongst the participants should be that the environment is non-judgmental and relaxing. They should not be intimidated. They should be able to speak openly without fear. They should have regard for the feelings of their fellow participants. So they should not be insulting or intimidating, but at the same time they should be able to put forward their views on the particular topic openly. And the facilitator should draw out the differences of opinion and focus the discussion on these differences. Look at what is it that differs between them and see what's causing the difference. Now, the significance of the focus group approach. The analysis of a focus group can shed light on the following. How group opinions emerge. Perhaps people living in the same area may have the same opinions. How does this happen? People working in a particular company may have the same opinions, may have similar opinions. How can that happen? What is it that leads to that? Who forms the opinions to start? Who are the opinion leaders? Why are these people the opinion leaders? How did this happen? How did they emerge as the opinion leaders? How do factions and subgroups emerge? Within any organization, there is the main thrust of the organization, the main channel for the communications within the organization and authority within the organization, but there may be factions in the management who disagree with certain policies. There may be subgroups who are not totally committed to certain objectives of the business, subgroups of managers or of workers. So how did this happen? How did they emerge? What's their power and where did it come from and why did it happen? How do opinions shift? Why do people change their opinions? If they believe certain things at certain times, why do they change it later? So focus groups give greater insight into group dynamics and more information compared to static interviews. Focus groups is a very dynamic situation. Opinions may change even during the focus group session. So it's a very dynamic situation and gives a much greater insight into issues than perhaps a very static interview technique. Problems with the focus group approach. Well, group members do not participate equally. It may be some people talk a lot, other people don't talk very much at all. Some people are extrovert, some people are introvert. It depends. Not always suitable for sensitive areas of research. In society there may be sensitive areas relating to religion or morality or health issues or whatever, and focus groups may be difficult in dealing with those situations and do require real experts to handle those situations. In business, there may be sensitive areas about pay, or about organisation, or about seniority, or promotions, and they also would have to be handled sensitively. Relation of facilitator to the group in terms of class, gender, ethnicity, experience, if very different, might be a reluctance to share experiences. The facilitator should be carefully chosen to match the group under consideration. If the facilitator is seen as a different class and has different opinions and it comes across as radically different to the group, the facilitator may not be trusted, and hence the whole experience may fail. So it's important that the facilitator is seen as someone that the group can relate to. And there are practical issues. The correct room setup and recording equipment and accurate transcription. It's important all of these things are in place. A nice room that will facilitate the discussion, and the recording equipment should be unobtrusive, it shouldn't be in their faces, and it should be later transcribed accurately to get an accurate picture. Otherwise it's been a waste of time. So those are some of the issues associated with the focus group, and these are some of the issues that I want to raise in this session on research techniques. As I said at the start, it overlaps significantly with other videos, and it's important that you go across those videos as well, make your own notes, pad out your own notes, think of the issues, and be prepared to deal with any questions or issues arising from this topic. But that's all I'm going to do for the moment, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.